I used to think my marriage was solid. Jill and I had been together for over a decade, and we'd built what I thought was a great life. Two wonderful boys, a nice house, steady careers. People always said we were the perfect couple. I believed them. For years, I didn't question it. But looking back now, I wonder how long the cracks had been there, just waiting for the right moment to split everything apart. It started subtly. Jill began changing in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. At first, it was harmless stuff: new clothes, a sudden interest in the gym, more time spent on her phone. I didn't think much of it. People change, right? But then she met Vivian. Vivian was this larger-than-life personality who swept into our lives like a tornado. Loud, confident, and completely unapologetic, she had this way of making everything about her. Her husband, Greg, was the opposite: quiet, awkward, the kind of guy who seemed content to let Vivian run the show. When Jill started spending her Wednesday nights out with Vivian, I figured it was good for her to have a friend. Raising two young boys was exhausting, and maybe she just needed a break. But soon, those Wednesday nights started stretching later and later. She'd come home smelling of expensive perfume and wine, brushing off my questions with vague excuses. We went to a wine bar, she'd say with a dismissive laugh. "You wouldn't like it, Mark. It's too fancy for you." That stung more than I wanted to admit. The shift in her attitude was impossible to ignore. Jill went from warm and affectionate to cold and distant almost overnight. She'd snap at me over the smallest things or roll her eyes when I suggested spending time together. "We're not kids anymore, Mark," she'd say. "Not everything has to revolve around you." I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was stressed. Maybe I wasn't being attentive enough. I started going out of my way to make things easier for her, taking on more with the boys, planning date nights, complimenting her more. But it didn't help. If anything, she became more aloof, more dismissive. Then came the night of the barbecue. Greg had been drinking, and it didn't take long to see he was completely out of his depth. He hovered near the grill while Vivian commanded the crowd, her laugh loud enough to drown out everyone else's conversations. I was flipping burgers when Greg leaned in, his words slurred but heavy with meaning. "Mark," he started, avoiding my eyes. "There's something you should know." I set the spatula down, my stomach tightening. "What is it?" He hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "Vivian and Jill, they're not just friends. They've been seeing other men. Together." My mind went blank. I couldn't process what he was saying. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Vivian started it," Greg muttered, shame coloring his face. "But Jill, she's part of it now. I thought you should know." I stared at him, my chest tightening with disbelief. I wanted to yell at him, accuse him of lying, but deep down, something told me he wasn't. The pieces started falling into place: the late nights, the secrecy, the dismissive attitude. How had I missed it? That night, after the boys were asleep, I confronted Jill. I waited in our bedroom, my heart pounding, until she finally walked in, her phone clutched in her hand. She didn't even look at me as she kicked off her shoes and reached for a nightgown. "Jill," I said, my voice strained. "We need to talk." She sighed, rolling her eyes like I was an annoying coworker instead of her husband. "What now, Mark?" "I know about you and Vivian," I said, my hands shaking. "And I know you've been with other men." For a moment, she froze. Then, to my shock, she smirked. "So what if I have?" she said, her voice dripping with defiance. "What are you going to do about it?" Her words hit me like a slap. I stammered, searching for something, anything to say. But before I could respond, she crossed her arms and kept going. "You want to leave me? Go ahead. But you'll lose everything, Mark. The house, the boys, your precious image. You think you have any power here? You don't." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't the Jill I had married. This was someone cold, calculating, and completely unrepentant. She didn't even try to deny it or apologize. Instead, she looked at me like I was weak, like I was nothing. That night, as she slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I felt humiliated, betrayed, and powerless. But then a new feeling crept in: resolve. Jill thought she'd won, that she had all the control. But she didn't know me as well as she thought. She had made her choices. Now it was time for me to make mine. After Jill's brazen confession, something inside me snapped. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the sheer audacity, the lack of remorse, the smug way she looked at me like I was nothing more than an obstacle in her life. She thought I was powerless, that I'd roll over and accept this new normal. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I woke up each morning feeling like I'd been sucker punched, the weight of Jill's words pressing down on my chest. But I didn't let it show. I couldn't. Jill had made it clear she would use everything, our kids, our finances, our entire life, against me if I tried to fight her. So, I stayed calm. I played the part of the oblivious, defeated husband. And all the while I planned. Jill, on the other hand, seemed to thrive in her new role. She wore her infidelity like a badge of honor, coming and going as she pleased with barely an explanation. Her Wednesday nights with Vivian stretched longer and longer, sometimes bleeding into the early hours of Thursday morning. When I asked her where she'd been, she'd wave me off with some vague excuse. "You wouldn't understand, Mark," she'd say with a condescending smirk. "It's nothing you need to worry about." But I did worry, not because I cared what she did. I was past that, but because I knew I needed evidence. Proof that would leave no doubt about what she'd been up to. Proof I could use when the time came to make my move. It started with her phone. Jill had become careless, leaving it on the counter or plugged into charge while she showered. One night, while she was upstairs, I took my chance. Her passcode was easy enough to guess. It was our oldest son's birthday, of all things. I scrolled through her messages, and what I found confirmed everything Greg had told me. There were texts from Vivian, filled with inside jokes and thinly veiled references to their escapades. "Last night was wild," one read. "We should try that new club next week. Heard it's a great hunting ground." Then there were the messages from other men. "Explicit, shameless, disgusting. Can't stop thinking about you," one text read. Another had a photo attached, one I wish I could erase from my memory. My stomach churned, but I kept scrolling, taking screenshots of everything and emailing them to myself. The more I dug, the worse it got. Jill wasn't just cheating. She was living a double life. Fancy dinners, expensive hotel rooms, secret meetups in places I'd never heard of. And Vivian was right there with her, egging her on at every turn. By the time Jill came back downstairs, I'd locked her phone and put it back exactly where I'd found it. She glanced at me briefly before heading to the kitchen, completely unaware of what I'd just uncovered. I sat on the couch, my hands trembling as I stared at the TV. The images from her messages burned into my mind. It was a dreary Friday night when I ran into Greg again. The fluorescent lights of the liquor store cast a cold glow over the aisles, and the faint hum of the refrigerator units provided a strange kind of solace in the otherwise quiet space. I was there for a bottle of whiskey, something to dull the constant buzz of frustration and anger that had settled into my chest. Greg, on the other hand, looked like he was there for escape. He stood near the beer section, staring blankly at the rows of six-packs as if he couldn't decide or didn't care. His hunched shoulders and tired eyes mirrored exactly how I felt inside. I approached him slowly, and for a brief moment, I saw something flash across his face. Recognition, then guilt, and finally fear. "Greg," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. He flinched like I'd caught him red-handed. "Mark," he replied, shifting uncomfortably. His hand tightened around the six-pack he'd picked up. "I need to know everything," I said, cutting to the chase. Greg hesitated, his gaze darting toward the exit. For a second, I thought he might bolt, but then his shoulders slumped, and he gave a weary nod. "Let's talk outside," he muttered. We ended up in Greg's car, the rain pattering lightly on the windshield. The stale smell of fast food and cigarette smoke clung to the interior, but I barely noticed. My focus was on Greg, who sat gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. "It started a few years ago," he began, his voice heavy with shame. "Vivian, she's always been like this, flirting with other men, testing boundaries. At first, I thought it was harmless, just her way of getting attention. But then she started crossing lines." I sat silently, letting him talk. I could tell this wasn't something he wanted to share, but the words poured out like a flood once he started. "She'd go out with her friends, telling me it was just girls' night. But she'd come back late, sometimes not until the next morning. I confronted her, of course, but she'd laugh it off. Said I was paranoid, that I didn't trust her. Greg let out a bitter laugh. Turns out I wasn't paranoid enough. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. "And Jill?" I asked. Greg winced like I'd struck him. "Vivian dragged her into it," he admitted. "She's been doing this empowerment thing, telling other women they don't have to settle, that they deserve to have fun." Jill bought into it. Completely. I leaned back in my seat, staring out the rain-streaked window. The image of Jill as the loving wife, the devoted mother, shattered further with every word Greg said. "They go to bars," Greg continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Clubs. They act like they're single, new names, fake stories, the whole thing. Vivian loves it. She gets off on corrupting people. And Jill, she's not the same person anymore. She's just like Vivian now." His words hung in the air, heavy and damning. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Greg fumbled with the six-pack, pulling out a can and offering me one. I shook my head, too numb to drink. He cracked it open and took a long swig, his Adam's apple bobbing as he gulped it down. "I'm sorry, Mark," he said finally, not meeting my eyes. "I should have told you sooner, but I didn't know how." I nodded, my jaw tight. "It's not your fault, Greg." But deep down, I wasn't sure I believed that. He'd known for how long? Weeks? Months? And he hadn't said anything? Maybe it wasn't his responsibility, but the betrayal felt compounded by his silence. For a long time, we sat there in the car, the sound of the rain filling the gaps in our conversation. I tried to make sense of it all, but there was no logic to what Jill had done. She wasn't a victim in this. She had made a choice, a deliberate, selfish choice to destroy what we had built together. For what? Cheap thrills? Validation from strangers? The thought of her smiling at some random man, pretending she wasn't married, filled me with a bitterness I couldn't shake. As Greg and I sat in silence, a thought began to take shape in my mind. Jill thought she had all the power. She thought she could manipulate me, hold our family hostage with her threats of divorce and custody battles. But she was wrong. If Jill wanted to destroy our family, fine. But I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. She didn't get to shatter my life and my boys' lives without consequences. Greg broke the silence, his voice trembling slightly. "What are you going to do?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stared at the rain running down the windshield, my reflection distorted in the glass. "I'm going to fix this," I said finally. My tone was calm, but inside, a storm was brewing. Greg looked at me, his expression uncertain. "Be careful, Mark. Vivian. Jill, they're not worth losing yourself over." I glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "Don't worry about me, Greg. I got this." I stepped out of the car, the cold rain hitting my face as I walked back to my own. My mind was already racing, piecing together the beginnings of a plan. Jill thought she'd won. She thought she could humiliate me, use our kids as leverage, and walk away unscathed. But she had underestimated me. She wouldn't see it coming. I started laying the groundwork for what was to come. I contacted a private investigator, a no-nonsense guy who came highly recommended by a colleague. I gave him everything I had, texts, screenshots, hotel receipts, and asked him to dig deeper. Meanwhile, I continued playing my role at home, letting Jill believe she was in control. One night, as we sat at the dinner table with the boys, Jill casually mentioned wanting to travel. "Africa's always been on my bucket list," she said, swirling her wine. "A safari, luxury lodges. It would be amazing." I smiled, my mind already racing. "Maybe we should go," I said, my tone light. "Just the two of us. A chance to reconnect." Jill raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. But then she smirked. "Maybe you're finally learning, Mark." I forced a chuckle, my stomach turning at her arrogance. She thought she'd won. She thought I was giving in, but she had no idea. This wasn't a retreat. It was the beginning of her downfall. Jill's smugness in the weeks leading up to our romantic getaway was hard to stomach. She strutted around the house like a queen, convinced that she'd broken me. Her tone softened, not out of kindness, but with the kind of condescension you'd use for a pet that had finally learned a new trick. "This trip will be good for us, Mark," she said one night while scrolling through her phone. You're finally starting to understand what I need. I nodded, forcing a weak smile. I just want you to be happy. That much was true, but not in the way Jill thought. I wasn't planning this trip to rebuild our marriage. I was planning it to end it. Every detail was carefully considered, from the flights to the accommodations. While Jill fantasized about safaris and candlelit dinners under the African sky, I worked behind the scenes to ensure everything would go according to my plan. The private investigator had continued to uncover more about Jill's escapades, and the evidence was staggering. Photos of her with strange men, receipts for lavish dinners and expensive gifts, even surveillance footage of her sneaking into hotels. She wasn't just careless, she was brazen. And while I'd initially planned to use this evidence in a legal battle, I realized something more personal, more final, was required. In secret, I coordinated with local contacts in Africa. A friend of a friend helped me set up the paperwork I would need to execute my plan. By the time our departure date arrived, I had everything in place. False documents, a fabricated story, and connections with local authorities who were willing to believe the narrative I'd carefully constructed. The morning we left, Jill was practically glowing. She kissed the boys goodbye with a theatrical flair, promising them amazing souvenirs from the trip. I watched her, a hollow feeling settling in my chest. She didn't deserve their love, their trust, but she'd have to live with the consequences of betraying it. As we boarded the plane, Jill chattered excitedly about all the things she wanted to do. "We'll start with the safari," she said, flipping through a travel guide. "And then maybe some beach time. Oh, and I've heard the markets are incredible." I nodded along, pretending to care, while my mind focused on what lay ahead. I let her take the lead, acting the part of the docile husband, trying to patch things up. By the time we landed, she was completely at ease, convinced that I'd fallen back into her trap. We spent the first few days indulging in the activities Jill had planned. Safari tours, shopping trips, extravagant meals. All the while, I observed her, waiting for the perfect moment to set my plan in motion. She reveled in the luxury, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. On the third day, I suggested we visit a remote wildlife sanctuary, far from the bustling tourist areas. "It's supposed to be incredible," I told her over breakfast. "Once-in-a-lifetime kind of thing." Jill's eyes lit up. "That sounds amazing. Let's do it." The sanctuary was breathtaking. Vast plains dotted with acacia trees, herds of animals roaming freely against the backdrop of a brilliant African sunset. Jill was in her element, snapping photos and gushing about how perfect everything was. We stayed late into the evening, exploring the area and soaking in the beauty. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting everything in an orange glow, I led Jill away from the group under the pretense of finding a better view. "This is incredible," she said, her voice hushed as she gazed at the landscape. "It is," I replied, my tone calm. "A perfect place for reflection." She turned to me, her expression shifting slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" I held her gaze, my voice steady. "It means you've made a lot of choices, Jill. Choices that have consequences." Her smile faltered. "Mark, what are you talking about?" "You'll see," I said, turning and walking back toward the group. Jill hesitated, clearly rattled, before following me. By the time we returned to the lodge that night, Jill was quieter than usual. I could see her trying to piece together my cryptic words, but I gave her nothing else to go on. I wanted her unsettled, unsure of what was happening. The next morning, I made my move. While Jill was busy arranging her day with the concierge, I quietly checked out of the lodge. I had already packed my bags the night before, leaving only her belongings behind. I handed the concierge a sealed envelope containing forged documents, along with instructions to deliver it to Jill after I'd left. Then I slipped out of the lodge, got into the waiting car, and began the drive to the airport. As the car pulled away, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, satisfaction, and, if I'm honest, a twinge of guilt. But it didn't last long. Jill had made her bed, and now she'd have to lie in it. By the time Jill realized I was gone, I was already well into the airport security line, slipping my shoes back on and watching the conveyor belt spit out my carry-on. My heart beat steadily, not from nerves but from a sense of closure I hadn't felt in years. As I passed through the terminal, My phone buzzed once, twice, then incessantly. I didn't need to look to know who it was. I had turned off the ringer earlier, silencing the noise Jill would inevitably make once she discovered I wasn't at breakfast or the lodge or anywhere else she thought I'd be. By now, she had surely opened the envelope I left behind, a neatly folded piece of stationery that would forever rewrite her narrative. Inside, I had crafted a careful, damning tale. Jill, enchanted by the allure of a wealthy admirer, had chosen to stay in Africa. The admirer, a fabricated figure named Mr. Mensa, was described as a generous local businessman who had captured her heart and promised her a life of luxury. The story was ridiculous, but not so far-fetched that it couldn't hold up, especially not in a place where paperwork and influence were often taken at face value. The lodge staff, thoroughly briefed, would assure her that they were only following the wishes outlined in the documents I'd provided. The local authorities, already sympathetic to the story, had been instructed to treat Jill as an honored guest of her new patron. She would be cared for, of course, but leaving? That wouldn't happen easily, not without the paperwork I deliberately arranged to delay. As I boarded my flight, I couldn't help but smile, a faint, private grin I kept hidden from the other passengers. Jill had spent so much time playing her games, manipulating people, believing she was untouchable. But in the end, her arrogance had sealed her fate. She thought she was clever, invincible even. She never saw it coming. Back at the lodge, Jill's morning started leisurely, as it often did. She'd wandered down to breakfast expecting to find me, her mood buoyant as she planned our next excursion. But when I wasn't there, her annoyance flared briefly. Probably sulking again, she muttered to herself, taking her seat by the window. The staff brought her coffee and pastries, all smiles as though nothing was amiss. It wasn't until the waiter handed her the envelope, marked with her name in my handwriting, that her stomach began to churn. "What's this?" she asked, but the waiter merely gestured politely and walked away. Jill tore it open, her brows furrowed in confusion. As her eyes scanned the text, her confusion morphed into disbelief. Then came the panic. "This can't be real," she whispered, her hands trembling slightly as she read and reread the letter. The words painted a vivid picture of her supposed decision to remain in Africa. "Jill Evans has chosen to begin a new chapter," it said, detailing her connection with Mr. Mensa and her intent to stay as his guest indefinitely. She bolted from the table, clutching the letter, and stormed toward the front desk. The concierge greeted her with a calm, professional demeanor. "Good morning, Mrs. Evans. How can I assist you? Where is Mark?" Jill demanded, her voice sharp. The concierge hesitated just long enough for Jill's irritation to bubble over. "He checked out early this morning, ma'am. I believe he left a note explaining your arrangements." "Arrangements? What arrangements?" Jill's voice rose, drawing the attention of nearby staff and guests. "Your stay here," the concierge replied, his tone measured but firm. "Mr. Evans informed us that you'd be staying indefinitely as a guest of Mr. Mensa. All accommodations have been arranged." Jill felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "This is insane," she hissed. "I'm not staying here. I want my passport and a ticket home now." "I'm afraid that won't be possible at the moment, ma'am," the concierge said, his expression unchanging. "The authorities have your documents for verification. It's a standard process for extended stays." "Extended stays?" Jill sputtered, her voice cracking. "There's been a mistake. I didn't agree to this." But no amount of shouting or pleading swayed the staff. The documents I'd left were clear, the local authorities had been prepared, and Jill's growing desperation only solidified the story. As the day wore on, Jill tried everything. She called my number repeatedly, only to hear the cold monotone of a disconnected line. She searched through her belongings, hoping for some clue, some mistake I might have made. But everything was in order, perfectly orchestrated, airtight. It wasn't until evening, when she sat alone in the empty dining room, that the weight of the situation fully hit her. For the first time, Jill realized just how deeply she had miscalculated. She thought about our life together, the years we had spent building a family. She had always seen me as predictable, easy to manipulate. She never imagined I was capable of this, of outsmarting her, of turning the tables so completely. And as the sun set over the savannah, casting long shadows across the lodge, Jill finally understood what she had lost. This wasn't just about her freedom or her pride. This was about everything she had taken for granted: the stability, the trust, the family she had destroyed with her own hands. But it was too late. There was no one left to manipulate, no one to save her from the mess she'd made. For Jill, this was only the beginning of her reckoning. When Jill finally pieced together what had happened, her initial shock gave way to fury. She stormed to the lodge's front desk, demanding answers, only to be met with polite but firm resistance. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the concierge said, holding the envelope I'd left behind. "Mr. Evans informed us that you'd be staying longer as a guest of Mr. Mensah. All arrangements have been made." "Who the hell is Mr. Mensah?" Jill snapped, her voice rising. "This has to be a mistake. I need to leave now." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The lodge staff had been briefed, and the forged documents were convincing enough to ensure her stay wasn't questioned. When Jill tried to book a return flight, she discovered that her passport was no longer in her possession. The authorities, following the instructions I'd left behind, insisted it was being verified for her new residence. Panicked, Jill called my phone repeatedly, but I had prepared for this. The number was disconnected, and any attempt to reach me through other means would lead to a voicemail box that I would never check. She was stranded, cut off from everything she knew, left to face the consequences of her actions. Back at home, I began the next phase of my plan. Jill's disappearance wouldn't go unnoticed, and I needed to control the narrative before she found a way to reach anyone. I crafted a carefully worded email to friends and family, explaining that Jill had decided to stay in Africa to pursue a personal journey. "She's chosen to take some time for herself," I wrote. "The boys and I support her decision, and will be here for her when she's ready to return." The response was mixed. Some people expressed shock, others sympathy, and a few, like Vivian, saw it as an opportunity. Vivian was the linchpin of Jill's betrayal, the one who had pulled her into this toxic world of lies and infidelity. I wasn't about to let her escape unscathed. Using Jill's email account, I reached out to Vivian, pretending to be her. "Africa is amazing," I wrote. "You'd love it here. You should come visit me. It's everything we talked about." Vivian's reply came quickly. "That sounds incredible. I could really use a break from Greg. Let me know when and where." I set the wheels in motion, coordinating with the same contacts I'd used to trap Jill. Within a week, Vivian was on a plane, convinced she was flying to join Jill's glamorous new life. When Vivian arrived in Africa, she was greeted with confusion. Jill wasn't waiting for her at the airport, nor was there any sign of the luxury lifestyle she'd been promised. Instead, she was met by local authorities, who escorted her to the same remote lodge where Jill was still fuming. The reunion was anything but joyful. Jill, disheveled and furious, immediately lashed out. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "I thought you invited me." Vivian snapped back, her confidence waning as the reality of the situation sank in. The two women quickly turned on each other, their alliance unraveling in the face of their shared predicament. Jill blamed Vivian for dragging her into this mess, while Vivian accused Jill of lying about the supposed paradise awaiting her. But it didn't matter who was at fault. They were both trapped, victims of their own arrogance and my carefully executed plan. Back home, I paid a visit to Greg. He looked surprised to see me, but invited me in, his nervous energy palpable. I handed him an envelope containing the evidence of Vivian's infidelity and a brief explanation of her current situation. "She's not coming back anytime soon," I said bluntly. "You're free, Greg. Do what you need to do." Greg flipped through the photos and documents, his hands shaking. "I don't know what to say," he muttered. "You don't have to say anything," I replied. "Just take care of yourself." With Vivian out of his life, Greg began to rebuild. He filed for divorce, using the evidence I'd provided to ensure she wouldn't walk away with anything more than she deserved. For the first time in years, he looked like a man who could breathe again. Back at the lodge, Jill's fury burned hot in the first hours after my departure. She stormed through the halls, her heels clicking sharply against the polished wooden floors, her anger palpable. Every staff member she approached wore the same polite but firm expression, the same rehearsed responses. "I need to speak to someone in charge," she demanded at the front desk, her voice sharp and commanding. The concierge, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, inclined his head respectfully. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Evans. All arrangements for your stay have been confirmed. Mr. Mensah has ensured that your needs will be fully accommodated." Jill clenched her fists, her voice rising. "I don't even know who this Mr. Mensah is. I never agreed to any of this. Where's my passport? I want it back now." The man's practiced smile didn't falter. "I'm afraid your documents are with the local authorities for verification, as is standard procedure for extended stays. This process can take time." "Time?" Jill snapped. "How much time?" "It's difficult to say, ma'am. A few weeks, perhaps longer. Until then, you are, of course, our esteemed guest." The thin veneer of courtesy only stoked Jill's rage. She slammed her hand on the counter, leaning in. "You don't understand. I need to leave. Now." The concierge's expression didn't change. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Evans. There's nothing more I can do at the moment." Jill's initial anger quickly spiraled into desperation as she realized just how thoroughly trapped she was. She tried calling the embassy, but every conversation was a dead end. Without her passport or proper documentation, there was little they could do. She pleaded, argued, even feigned tears, but the answers were always the same. "We'll investigate and get back to you." The days stretched on, each one a reminder of how powerless she had become. She scoured her belongings for anything that might help her, an old ID card, a credit card, anything, but found nothing useful. I'd ensured that her resources were limited to what the lodge provided, and they weren't about to deviate from the narrative I'd crafted. In a moment of desperation, Jill cornered one of the local guides, a young man who handled safari tours for the lodge's guests. "I need your help," she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. The guide hesitated, looking unsure. "What kind of help, ma'am?" "Money," Jill said, pulling a few crumpled bills from her bag. "I'll pay you to get me to the nearest airport." "No questions asked." The guide frowned, his gaze shifting to the security personnel stationed near the lodge's entrance. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't. It's not safe, and I'd lose my job." Jill's face crumpled as the young man walked away, leaving her alone with the weight of her failure. As the days turned into weeks, Jill's once flawless confidence began to crumble. The woman who had walked into this lodge full of smug superiority now moved through its halls like a ghost, her shoulders slumped, her steps hesitant. Her usual routine, meals in the dining hall, long walks around the property, became exercises in futility. Every moment was a reminder of how isolated she was, how completely she had underestimated me. At night, she lay awake in the spacious bed, staring at the ceiling as her mind raced. She thought of me, of the life she'd so recklessly tossed aside. Images of the boys filled her thoughts. Their laughter, their hugs, the way they would light up when she walked into a room. Did they miss her? Did they even know she was gone? Or had I erased her so thoroughly that she was now just a void in their lives? The questions gnawed at her, but the answers were worse. She had gambled with her family, her marriage, her home, and she had lost. One afternoon, as Jill sat on the veranda overlooking the savannah, a soft breeze ruffled her hair. The beauty of the landscape, the golden plains, the distant acacia trees, was lost on her. She thought back to the early years of our marriage, when things had been simple, even joyful. She remembered the way I used to look at her, the way I always tried to make her laugh, even on the hardest days. She thought of the nights we'd spent planning our future, dreaming about the life we would build together. And then she thought of the choices she had made, the lies, the affairs, the arrogance that had driven a wedge between us. She had told herself she deserved more, that she was entitled to freedom, excitement, adventure. But sitting there, alone and powerless, she wondered if those things had been worth losing everything. For the first time, Jill was forced to confront the reality of her decisions. There was no escape, no one to manipulate or blame. The damage was done, and there was no going back. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Casting the lodge in a warm, amber glow, Jill remained on the veranda, lost in thought. The staff moved quietly around her, their polite smiles a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. She knew I wouldn't answer her calls. She knew no one was coming to rescue her. For years, she had played her games, believing she could outsmart anyone, control any situation. But she had underestimated me. For the first time in a long while, Jill felt something unfamiliar: humility. It was an unwelcome companion, one that reminded her of the life she had destroyed, the husband she had betrayed, and the family she had abandoned. And yet, there was no one to hear her apologies, no one to see her regret. In the stillness of the African night, Jill realized she was utterly, completely alone. As for me, I focused on what mattered most: my boys and our future. I kept the story of Jill's journey vague, sparing them the details of her betrayal. They didn't need to know the truth yet. Maybe they never would. I took satisfaction in knowing that justice had been served. Jill and Vivian had played their games, believing they were untouchable, but they had underestimated me. Their arrogance had been their downfall. And as I watched my boys play in the yard, their laughter filling the air, I knew I had made the right choice. Our lives were better without the lies, without the poison Jill and Vivian had brought into them. For the first time in a long time, I felt free,